So my name is Jeremy, and my PhD is in cognitive psychology. I was trained formally as somebody to study how the brain works. I then switched fields, and I became an engineer where I learned how to build immersive virtual reality. I now work at Stanford, where I run a virtual reality lab, and what I do is we build virtual reality, and we test to see how it affects the brain. But most relevant today, we build applications that can help people, and we are experts in the lab at building virtual reality that people can use for real-world applications. So in the next 45 minutes before you get to ask wonderful questions, what I'm going to do, the first thing is that no one's going to leave here without knowing exactly how the technology works and understanding why this moment in history is a very special time for virtual reality. I'm then going to take you through about 10 to 15 academic studies where we show that a virtual reality experience can profoundly change the way you think of yourself and others. And then I'm going to take you through about 5 or 6 applications where academic studies published in my lab became products that people are using around the world. At Stanford, we like to think of ourselves as a university that faces out, and it's okay for professors to build something and then to share it with the world for people to use it. But most importantly, I'm looking forward to talking with you guys. I hope you have some wonderful questions. My goal here today is to help you think about how you can use virtual reality for various applications. Okay, show of hands. How many of you guys have done virtual reality before? Raise them high. How many before today? Okay, 5 of you before today. Okay. For those of you that haven't done virtual reality, have you played the video game called Pac-Man? Okay. Virtual reality works just like Pac-Man. It's a cycle of 3 things. The first thing is called tracking, which is a fancy word for measuring your physical movements in the room. In Pac-Man, how do we track your movements? You have a joystick. That joystick has a spring, and we know if your wrist moved. So with Pac-Man, we track the movement of your wrist. It then draws that biter 1 pixel over, and then displays a new computer image to a screen and new sounds to speakers. So Pac-Man tracks the movement, redraws the scene, and sends new light to a screen and sound to speakers. Virtual reality works the same way, except instead of tracking abstractly, we measure your natural body movements. And let me talk about this simulation here. So watch this gentleman and think about what he's doing. So you're laughing at him now, but for those who are laughing, we actually brought this simulation here for you to do. It's sitting there in the other room. Let me describe it. He is in a world where the virtual room looks just like the physical room. We've modeled it to look just like his space. As he's walking, we're tracking his movements and updating the scene based on his movements. So in the physical world, when I take a step toward you guys, you should get a little bigger. If I turn my head over here, I should see the data over there. If I walk towards this door, things should get louder over here. So for every movement that he's making, and we track him down to 1/10 of 1 millimeter, we know his position, and we redraw the appropriate sights and sounds for the new position. Then we drop a 10-meter chasm, and we put a really rickety plank over that chasm. Okay? And the task is to walk across this plank. So let me take you back in time to the year 2001. In 2001, I've been studying virtual reality, by the way, since the late 90s. I've been doing this for a long time. In the year 2001, we brought one of the first ever working virtual reality systems to Washington, D.C., and I presented to 1,000 federal judges and lawyers about how you can use virtual reality to recreate crime scenes, so that witnesses and judges could see what a crime scene would be like and experience it firsthand. Part of that demonstration was giving people fun demos, just like we brought for you today, and we had this chasm with the plank, and I remember, like it was yesterday, one of the judges, he was probably in his late 60s, he probably weighed about 275 pounds, And when he was walking across this plank, he actually took a step to the left too far. We modeled gravity so he falls down. If this had happened to you in the physical world, what would you do? Yes, you'd scream, but what else would you do if you wanted to save your life? You would dive at a 45-degree angle and try to catch the far lip. So this 65-year-old judge dove at a 45-degree angle. And it gets worse because this is one of my first public demos. I'm now a seasoned veteran. There was a sharp table with an edge on the corner, and his face was going right for I had one move. My one move was to jump on him to change his trajectory so he hit the floor instead of the table. So he was fine. He was a little embarrassed. Nobody got sued, and VR survived. But we call this concept presence. We call this concept presence. For 20 years, I've been studying psychological presence. And that idea is when VR is done well, leveraging the way your body moves, the front of your brain, the cortex may be telling you that it's not real. But the back of your brain, that reptilian part that's evolved to survive, can't see past the illusion. So presence is, the fancy term for it is called the illusion of non-mediation. When VR is done right, there's no gadgets. There's no interface. You're just having an experience. And for those of you who are laughing, I've given today to about 15 to 20 of you have done this, and we've had some pretty extreme reactions. So the good news is after this talk, if you're interested, you get to go try it yourself, and I'll be around, and I can't wait to show it to you. So questions on how virtual reality works? Make sense? Great. So at Stanford, I run what's arguably the most advanced virtual reality lab on the planet. We have visits by heads of state. We have visits from the military and NASA. It is a destination for CEOs to learn about the future of technology. And I can brag about that because I just have really smart grad students, and we have good resources for Stanford. It's an amazing place. That being said, the lab is becoming completely and utterly obsolete. Okay? This is a magic time for virtual reality because for the first time ever, you no longer need to have million-dollar labs to produce the experience. So in March of 2014, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, came to my lab and spent about 3 hours with us, and we taught him about how to use virtual reality for education, for alleviating poverty, for health applications. Everything I'm going to talk about today, Zuckerberg really received this message quite well. 2 weeks later, my second daughter Edie is born, and I was expecting to just have a lovely vacation because I'm a professor and we get to spend time with our families. The day after Edie was born, Zuckerberg spends $2.3 billion to buy a company that no one has heard of called Oculus. They had no patents that were protectable. They'd never made a penny. They didn't have a consumer product. Zuckerberg spends $2.3 billion to tell the world that virtual reality is coming. The New York Times runs a front-page article on the business section saying that Bailenson, in part, caused Zuckerberg to buy Oculus. And from that moment on, I have the privilege of being able to come to places like this and to talk about how we can use virtual reality for business, for government, to help the planet. Not just to talk about Facebook, Google, I've got similar interactions with them. I'm on the advisory board for Samsung, who's the first to come to market with what's called the Samsung Gear. Sony's got a competing product. The big companies are all in an arms race to bring consumer electronics to your living room, and it's going to happen in the next 6 months. It's a very special time, very special time. So all of you in this room are probably like my 90-year-old grandfather. And you're saying, well, what am I supposed to do in there? Okay? He put on the helmet and he looked around and he said, and what I'm going to talk about you today, this is the cover from a very influential book called Catch-22, a book about paradoxes. I believe that virtual reality is a home run application if you leverage what I like to call the paradox. The brain treats it as real. We know this from the pit, but there are no rules. Any experience you can imagine, whether it's fast forwarding in time, growing older, traveling at the blink of an eye, anything you can imagine, turning off physics, we can do. And so what I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes is talking about academic studies that I've performed that show that this magic juxtaposition of being able to do anything, but having the brain treated as real, it's a very special way to think about training. In 2003, a woman named Marcia Satowski, she was then an executive at Cisco. Cisco had given my lab a small academic grant. She came to me and she said, Jeremy, I would love it if you could build better ways to train diversity. The way we train diversity right now and tolerance is we have somebody say, imagine you're a woman and your boss harasses you, or imagine that you were black and somebody said something nasty to you, or we have actors recreate scenes. It doesn't work. And so what we leveraged is an academic idea called the contact hypothesis that was brought up by sociologists in the 1960s in the US, which is if you take blacks and whites and you put them together, they're going to learn to get along. We decided to take this to the next level. What if instead of being around somebody else, you literally became somebody else? So this movie is old. So don't laugh at the graphics. I like to show it for a sense of history. In 2003, we built a simulation to teach whites how to not be racist against blacks. And what happens here is we induce something called body transfer. Neuroscientists have proven that if I walk up to a virtual mirror and I move around, and I see myself in the mirror moving with me, I truly feel like that's me in the mirror. It's called consciousness transfer, and it feels quite real. So he's a white male. He gestures in front of the mirror for about 4 minutes, really feels like it's him. He bends down, he comes up, and he's now a woman of color. And then what happens, the next step, and I won't show you this next step, is he turns around, there's a second person in virtual reality with him, and that person treats him racist, and he treats him in a sexist manner, and he experiences it while wearing the body of a woman of color. So we've been publishing for over 10 years, whether it's about reducing racism, sexism, ageism, discrimination against a handicapped. If you have somebody become someone else and feel trauma while wearing their body, that this compared to just about any other control condition you can think of, this changes the way people think in terms of prejudice. It's powerful. It changes their behavior. So let's fast forward to the year 2015. This is Adam Silver, the commissioner of the National Basketball Association. He came to visit my lab, and the reason he came is because somebody had wrongly told him that it would be a wonderful idea to put on a virtual reality helmet and to watch an NBA game for 3 hours. Therefore, he could gain an extra 1 billion fans in China. Okay? So that's why he came to the lab, and I quickly told him that as a VR guy, I'd never worn a helmet for more than 15 minutes, and there's a lot of problems with the idea of watching a sports game. However, there are a lot of athletes who are young kids that get paid a lot of money, and they get themselves into some big trouble in terms of abusing women, children, and racist acts. And what I talked for hours with Adam Silver about, which we're now working with him on, is coming up with virtual reality simulations to teach his players, like any other young men who find they need to have some life experiences, to learn more about these issues of tolerance. So we're working with the NBA, and then this is me giving a demo to Roger Goodell, who is the commissioner of the National Football League. Now, the National Football League has gone through a lot of public issues with its players having some problems off the field. And to Commissioner Goodell's credit, he came to the lab because he wanted to learn more about what we could do to help his players and his management to create scenes and office workplaces that are more friendly to those who may be different from others. And spending a lot of time working with both these organizations to take this very old idea that we proved in the lab, and now that the equipment costs hundreds of dollars as opposed to millions of dollars, we get to actually build and test this work. The next line of research I want to talk about is behavior modeling. So there's about 40 years of work, not out of my lab, but from other labs, that show that if you play very violent video games for hours and hours a day, you will be more aggressive in the physical world. This is uncontroversial from the psychologists that read the work. It's not my research. We wanted to do the opposite. What if you put somebody in a virtual reality experience that's super intense and arousing, just like walking that plank? It feels real, but instead of killing people, you're saving people's lives. Will this lesson of doing a good deed while in virtual reality transfer the same way that we know video game violence, aggression transfers out of the world. So in this
There
experiment,
has been an earthquake warning and the city has been evacuated. A child has been unaccounted for and the parents have informed authorities that their child is diabetic and will go into shock without insulin. You have a vial of insulin in your pocket. Your task is to fly through the city to find the child and deliver the insulin, saving the child's life. As soon as you see the child, call out. You must indicate to the experimenter that you found the child, so please clearly announce that you see the child when the child comes into view. You may now begin your search. Lift your arms above your head to take off from the ground. Thankfully, you've reached the child before diabetic shock set in. You hand the syringe to the child who injects the insulin. You have now completed your task and saved the child's life.
okay, so subject gets this intense experience of flying, and when I say it's intense, when we bring astronauts to the lab, they spend an hour in there. You can't get them out of there. It really feels like you're flying, and we give them a special gift. They can fly like a hero, and they save a child's life. What we then do is we have an actress fake an accident. Okay, so what happens here is that the subject, who has no idea this is part of the study, it is a classic social psychology metric. She fakes an accident. We're videotaping him to see how helpful he is when she has an accident.
Okay. Did you have any trouble with dizziness or anything? Oh, good.
So we see how helpful he is. What we do is we time how quickly he starts and how many pens he picks up. We've now replicated this study. When you become a hero and fly and save a child's life, every single person helps. In the control conditions, many people don't help. If they help more slowly and less thoroughly. This work is replicated. And this is not surprising to us. We know that people model media behavior. If you can create VR simulations that teach helping and altruism, people will model it. I know a lot of us in this room care about sustainability. And I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who was the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association under President Obama for 4 years. Okay? In those 4 years, Dr. Lubchenco witnessed more natural disasters than any other 4-year period in U.S. history. We know that climate change is affecting the level of disasters that we're getting. Now, Dr. Lubchenco had an amazing quote, and it was, when people directly experience something, they see it in a different light. In the United States, there are many who still don't believe that climate change poses a serious threat. What Jane learned, Dr. Lubchenco, when her job was to visit these poor towns that were ravaged by natural disaster, her job was to go there and help the victims. It was an amazing job, but it broke her heart. What she learned, it doesn't matter if you live in a red state or a blue state, a conservative state or a democratic state, if your town was ravaged by disaster, you believe in climate change. So now let's go back to virtual reality. In virtual reality, disaster is free. At the touch of a button, I can bring on a flood. I can bring on a tornado. And so what I've been working for the last 12 years is using virtual reality to cause an effect to make that relationship more salient so that people can get a visceral, experiential understanding that human activity is changing the planet. I'll give you one example, and I can give you a dozen if you'd like during the Q&A. In the year 2009, the New York Times ran a story, and the story said if you use that soft, fluffy toilet paper that we all love, over the course of your lifetime, it's as if you're sawing down 2 trees. It turns out 50% of the pulp from non-recycled toilet paper comes from second-growth forest, 10% comes from virgin trees. So why are we cutting down trees for a very non-essential task, which is using toilet paper? I live in the crunchiest place on the planet, San Francisco, where all the hippies live. And most stores don't sell recycled toilet paper. So how do you resolve this? We ran a number of studies where we brought subjects to the lab Everybody got the statistics that I gave you, and then we had a third of the subjects read a beautifully written narrative, what would we like to cut down a tree. The second group of subjects saw a video shot from the shoulder of a lumberjack, and the third group put on the virtual reality helmet, came to the lab. They had a haptic device that shook their hands like a chainsaw, and they sawed down 2 trees. When the trees landed, the floor crashed and put their feet up. Really intense experience cutting down these trees. I have people call me 6 months after this experience, and they say, Jeremy, every time I go down that toilet paper aisle, I think of you. Okay? And I'm okay with that. I really am. We don't trust qualitative data. We look for quantitative data. In our experiments, what we do, we look at attitudes, but more importantly, we look at behaviors. It turns out that all 3 groups, when you ask them before and after the study, they all say they want to use less paper. With sustainable behaviors, all of us say we want to be green, but it's hard to change your daily behavior. It's really hard. The answer is because we don't have a direct experience. So all 3 groups said they were going to use less paper. Only the VR group actually changed their behavior. They used 20% less paper compared to the other groups when we tracked them physically. We've done similar studies with water use, a similar experience based on water. When I put sensors in people's sink, they use significantly less hot water as well. We've got lots of work in this area. It's a really neat application because it takes the abstraction, this I have no experience with a disparate future based on climate change, and it makes it very tangible. The next study is about the future. So it turns out if you take a 20-something can't imagine what it's like to be 40, let alone 75. So there is a famous philosopher, Parfit, who has long argued that humans are very good at imagining pleasure now. We have a really hard time imagining pain in the future. Therefore, we rarely defer gratification. So we ran a study where we took 20-somethings, they walked up to a virtual reality mirror, did the body transfer. We then hit a button, and they got to meet their future self, meaning I used graphics techniques to age their face, so they got to meet themselves when they were 65 years old. Okay? What we then did is we gave them a classic task where they got to have some money now, meaning we'd literally hand them 20 bucks, or if they put it in a savings account, they'd get more money in the future. So one of the hardest things to do is to get a 20-something to not take money right now. In the United States, we're going to have a huge problem with poverty for the current 20-somethings when they turn 65 because people are not putting money in the bank. And so we published a paper in the Journal of Market Research showing that 4 or 5 study paper that VR can change people's savings behavior. And I get calls from financial institutions constantly. This is the front page of the New York Times showing how Bank of America has produced something called Face Retirement, which is they build a future self version of you from your webcam. It can scan your face with enough angles as you move around. And then the interface to your B of A account is your future self. And your future self gets happier the more money you put in your bank account. Okay? And this is win-win, right? It's win-win. The New York Times gets more, or the Bank of America gets more clients, but 20-somethings now put money in the bank. And that's the kind of research that I like. The next study, one of my PhD students, her name was Grace Ahn, and she did the study that you may recognize from science fiction, which is called self-endorsing. Imagine that you're walking down a shopping mall and your body was being scanned by some scanners, which we can now do. And then by the time you reach the other end, there's a huge billboard, and there's you using a product you've never seen before, and beautiful people love you because you're using this product, right? The goal of endorsing is to find somebody who matches the demographic of the user, who's more your demographic than you. And so what Grace did is publish some studies showing that if you have somebody see their doppelganger, I call these, their avatar externally using a product they've never used, brand preference increases. Now, the brilliant engineer who did all the work here, her name was Maria Jabin. She left my lab and went to LinkedIn, and she built for them something called Picture Yourself, which basically LinkedIn figures a way to grab your picture. It sticks it next to a job description and says, picture yourself as the CEO of Rabobank. The data shows that this causes a 500% click-through rate compared to anything else they've ever tried. So another example of taking a finding from the lab, figuring out a way to make it work in nature, and seeing great results. I do a lot of work on health, and if somebody wants to ask me later on about pain management, we've got some great studies on VR for pain, but I really wanted to focus on eating behavior and exercising behavior given the interest of this group. So I'm going to show you a very old video in a second. In the United States, we've got a problem with eating healthy, and we've got a problem with doing exercise, and one of the reasons is because of a psychological construct called self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you actually can do something. I believe I can do 50 push-ups, and that inspiration caused me to be able to do it. With weight loss, this is a huge problem, and with choosing a healthy diet, this is a huge problem. So what Jessie did is she brought subjects in the lab, she scanned their bodies and faces, and they got to meet their doppelganger, meaning it was as if they were looking in a mirror. It looked just like you. Then what we did is we gave them accelerated feedback on their own body based on their behavior. So this is an old video, so excuse the graphics in it, but I do like to give a sense of history. But just watch what happens. So he's going to jog in place. Every 3 steps that his knees pass his waist, his avatar loses a pound. Remember, it looks just like him. So what he's doing is seeing himself transformed and getting an accelerated sense of what we call vicarious reinforcement, where he actually learns that in an implicit back brain way, I can do it. I can lose weight, because he gets to see it happen on his own body. And what we've demonstrated in what was Jessie Fox's dissertation, this causes people to change their diet, and it causes people to exercise much more than control conditions that others have tried. So lots of companies right now are taking this template of this accelerated sense of achievement to build self-efficacy, to give those who want to eat better foods, whether that means more sustainable or more healthy, and to help them make these decisions. In the year 2005, a guy named Derek Belch, who was the field goal kicker on the Stanford football team, took a class that I taught called Virtual People, which is a class very much like this lecture. It teaches about what virtual reality is, how you can use it. And in 2005, Derek said, Jeremy, can we use virtual reality to train football players? And back then I said, Derek, we cannot do this. The technology is not there. So Derek went off and he got an MBA from USC. He got a master's degree in journalism. And in the year 2014, he came back to do a 3rd master's degree with me in my lab, while simultaneously he was a coach on the Stanford football team. And what we designed, which I brought and I can show you later on, we designed a way to train football players to make better decisions. So one of the constraints of football is that there's actually very little practice time because of labor laws and because of rules designed to rightly protect students. There's not much practice time on the field, and so that players don't get what we call repetitions, this mental practice and rehearsal. So we used this in the year 2014 with the Stanford team, and our quarterback, Kevin Hogan, was doing so well that the coach Shaw decided to make it mandatory that all the players had to use virtual reality for training. Kevin had a great year. Of course, he had a great year because he's an amazing athlete. We gave him another tool to help him achieve his goals. So Derek, in true Stanford University startup style, he graduates January 2nd. On January 3rd, he forms a startup called Striver, and Derek just goes out and sells this application. There's now 7 NFL teams using it, and 15 major college programs, NBA, NHL, WNBA, and very soon he's going to announce a couple of other sports. This company is 10 months old, and it is the first, in my opinion, successful business-to-business application of VR. There are 60 systems like the one that you can see out there, out with these teams. They're using it, and if anybody wants to be bored with statistics, I can tell you about the improvement in various players. This is really working well as a tool. The final thing I want to talk about is perhaps the biggest home run we could ever have in virtual reality. It's great to meet all of you guys. I've enjoyed meeting you throughout the day. And yes, a handshake is special. We could never Skype this. It wouldn't work. We can never do Cisco telepresence, it wouldn't work. But what I do is I build and design systems to leverage what's called social presence. There's a chapter in my new book, it's called The Virtual Handshake. And the new book isn't written yet, it's still in my head. And the virtual handshake is about using VR to recreate what makes face-to-face special and to allow people to reduce travel. Why do we hate travel? Fossil fuel, expense, time change, germs on the plane, you wasted time, and we can go on. We know video conferencing is not the answer. And what I can tell you, because I've been doing this for 20 years, we've made almost no products on this avatar communication stuff. And because of infrared cameras that can now scan your face in real time, I believe, not this year, what's going to come out in about 6 months is a really magical application where you have avatars on phones, and trust me, it looks great. In about 3 or 4 years, I truly believe that it's my hope, and I'm going to close on this, it's my hope that when we watch a movie from the 1970s, you see somebody smoking a cigarette in the hospital, and we say, look how ridiculous 1970s people were. They smoked cigarettes right on the patient's bed. My father drives every day from Peekskill, New York, down to the Bronx and back. Okay? He gets in a box, and he follows thousands of other boxes, and 2.5 hours of his day are spent in that box. And 30,000 people in the US a year die from car accidents. We should have travel when we want to, not when we have to. And it's my hope that we look back on the commute for work in the same way that I look back on smoking in the 70s over a patient in a hospital. So to conclude, it's the time to be building applications. It really is. The technology has gone from millions to hundreds, and it feels pretty good. We brought demos to show you. I hope you all do it, and I'm going to be around for the next couple hours. I'd love to hear how virtual reality can help you, so thank you for your wonderful attention.
This is all very fascinating and exciting. Thanks for this great talk and letting us see what you're doing. I'm interested in basically good versus evil uses of this technology.
Yeah.
If you could comment on
Yeah, so the question, as you all heard, was I focused on good stuff, but boy, there's got to be some bad stuff you can do. And the answer is yes. VR is a medium, just like video, just like the printed word. And for everything, if you go to, there's a website called Oculus Share. So the company that's winning right now in terms of the head-mount display is called Oculus. They've got a company called website called Share, which is kind of the Napster of Oculus, where you get to see all of the applications that are out there. Most of them are not like what I described today. You know, you can go in a guillotine and get your head cut off. You can play really violent video games where you get to saw somebody's. It's bad stuff. So, you know, what I can do, I'm a huge fan of free speech. The US Supreme Court has ruled that VR is free speech and anything goes. So it's our job to, you know, regulate our own use and regulate our kids' use, but more importantly, to create alternatives which are not horrible. And that's all I can say. Look, I'm not a VR evangelist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't play video games. I don't have a Facebook account. I think VR, when I showed that Catch-22, I believe VR, it's the title of the new book is Experience on Demand. VR is not a media experience, it's an experience. And my opinion is you shouldn't do anything in VR you wouldn't be willing to do in the physical world.
Looks like we have another question here, and then we'll go back there next.
One of the things that you mentioned was that this is an interesting time for virtual reality. In the next 6 months, we'll see major things. It would seem to me, I used to be in the tech business for a long time, what makes things take off is usability. So can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing from both the hardware standpoint and the development tools that allow companies like ours to take advantages without having to employ specialists?
So 3 weeks ago, in the history of events, I've been doing this for 20 years, in the history of events that have changed my life professionally, the New York Times delivered to my door, because we get the Sunday paper in California, something called Google Cardboard. Google Cardboard is a piece of cardboard that has lenses that can basically amplify light. It costs about $10. With my New York Times came a Google Cardboard. You slide your smartphone, which has more pixels than most head-mounted displays. The smartphone also has an accelerometer that can track your head movement. You slide the smartphone into Google Cardboard, and what you get is a window into a magical world where you see in stereo, you get transported to a place. And New York Times delivered that to my house. I took it out of the bag. I took my smartphone, hit a button to download a VR New York Times app, slid it in, and 4 minutes later I was doing VR, and it just, I was tearing up. It was such a transformational moment in the history, and I can give other stories like that, and I can talk offline about which hardware, software I think is more appropriate for different contexts, but, look, let's be clear. Virtual reality's history is full of idiots like me that have stood on stages like this and said, in 6 months, you're going to see VR, right? I may be wrong. I've got a lot of inside information, and I work a lot with these big companies who are putting in too much money to fail.
All right. We had another question right over here.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Efraín Reséndiz from Mexico. Sorry, too much ice last night. Just a question. We have there in Mexico an initiative of the owner of the company working, trying to develop a virtual vaccine against addictions. Yeah, actually we have there in our hometown in Culiacán interactive museum against the addictions. Have you worked something about that?
So I'm working on a PhD thesis. One of my PhD students is working on medical virtual reality right now. So I could give an entire class on medical applications of virtual reality. With addiction, where it's really useful is giving you a safe environment to avoid temptation. Okay, so if you are, say, an alcoholic, what I can do is I can have a therapist talk you through, walk in a room with a bar. Okay, no, look at it. It's okay to look, and I can get you closer to the bottles without having you actually have to go to a bar. So it's a really safe and portable, flexible way to expose you to how to learn the steps to avoid temptation. That's a really nice application of it. Of course, there's no magic bullets with this stuff. It's hard. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we are all out of time for questions, but Jeremy did say he'll be around for a little bit longer. If you haven't used the virtual reality equipment yet, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It's really unbelievable. And thank you so much for being here,
Thanks,
Jeremy.
guys.